Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to episode 12 of It's Murder Up North, the podcast that covers crimes that occur in the north of England, from the infamous to the obscure. Today's episode will focus on the crimes of Derrick, who inexplicably went on a 2-hour killing spree, covering 52 miles of peaceful countryside. Due to the large area affected by this crime, I have created a video exclusively for Patreon members detailing the route and timeline of events. When you sign up to Patreon, not only will you be supporting the podcast and helping it grow, you will have access to exclusive content, and you'll also get a special mention in a future episode, just like my latest supporter, Mira, who is listening in California. Thank you so much, Mira, for your support. As always, please feel free to contact me on Facebook or Twitter. Before we head to the episode, let me introduce you to JC and Kiki, the hosts of Mission Spooky. I started listening this week and love them. Here's a sneak peek of their show.
Hi, I'm your glorious host, JC from Mission Spooky!
And this is Kiki, the one who does all the work.
Join us every Tuesday for spooky subjects, mostly in Pennsylvania and other parts of Pennsylvania.
Like Far East Pennsylvania.
And far, far East Pennsylvania.
And sometimes we talk about magic and other paranormal subjects. You can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and where all great podcasts can be heard. Remember, stay spooky and don't die. But if you do, contact us.
Now, let's head to the episode. Cumbria is one of the most beautiful places in England, blessed with stunning coastline, majestic mountains and tranquil lakes. It is not surprising that an average of 15 million tourists visit England's second largest county. The county is made up of rural hamlets and close-knit communities, linked by narrow country roads that wind through the idyllic countryside. The coastal town of Whitehaven is one such community. It is an elegant Georgian port town, which grew through shipbuilding and coal mining. The town is proud to be the birthplace of George Washington's grandmother, Mildred Warner Gale, who was laid to rest at St. Nicholas's Church in the town. This quiet, picturesque town, nestled on the west coast of England, famous for its connection to an American president, would become infamous for the horrific events of June 2nd, 2010, when one man's spree tore through the heart of rural Cumbria. Although gun crime in the UK is not unknown, what unfolded in Cumbria that spring morning was a very rare event. Only 2 other events in recent history compared. The first, the Hungerford Massacre, which occurred on the 19th of August 1987, when Michael Ryan injured 15 and killed his mother, a police officer and 14 other innocent victims before turning the gun on himself. The second event took place at a primary school in Dunblane, Scotland, on the 13th of March 1996. At 9:30 that morning, Thomas Hamilton entered the school and made his way to the gym, where a class of 5-year-olds were having a lesson. He killed 16 children and 1 teacher before committing suicide. These incidents led to stricter gun laws and the ban on handguns. However, it's still possible for people to have access to guns. The laws in the UK regarding gun ownership are some of the strictest in the world and require all firearms to be licensed on a 5-year certificate issued by the regional police force. The holder of the firearms must have a reasonable purpose for acquiring them. To apply for a licence, the applicant must provide proof of identity, 2 referees of verifiable good character who have known the applicant for at least 2 years, approval from the applicant's family doctor to ensure the person is medically fit, and an inspection of the premises where the weapon will be kept. The applicant must also have a face-to-face interview with a firearms inquiry officer. A thorough background check of the applicant is then made by a special branch. Only when all these stages have been satisfied will a licence be issued, which must be renewed every 5 years. Derrick Bird passed the required checks. He had held a gun licence since 1976, and it was renewed in 2007. 3 years later, he would use his legally owned firearms to commit a horrendous crime. However, there were no warning signs. Derrick, who was known as Birdie in the town of Whitehaven, was a cheerful and well-liked character. He and his twin brother, David, were born in the town on the 27th of November 1957 to Joseph and Mary Bird. They had an older brother, Brian, and the 3 boys had a happy, normal childhood in the close-knit town of Whitehaven. When their parents divorced, the twins spent a lot of time with their father, who passed on his love for shooting and fishing. The boys left school at 16, and one teacher described them as being like chalk and cheese. David was outgoing, sporty and adventurous, whilst Derrick was quiet and introverted. The difference between the twins wasn't just down to personality, though. It seemed that one brother was dealt a fairer hand than the other. David lived in a large farmhouse worth £500,000. He had worked as a lorry driver and a mechanic, but found success as a building contractor. He was a divorcee with 3 daughters, Rachel, Tracy and Katie. He seemed to be very content with life. Derrick didn't marry, but lived with his partner Linda and their son Graham, who was born in 1982. Derrick worked at the area's largest employer, Sellafield Nuclear Power Plant, as a joiner. However, in 1990 he was caught stealing building materials, for which he received a 1-year suspended sentence and lost his job. This put immense strain on the family, as Derrick struggled to find employment and ultimately decided to become a self-employed taxi driver. Without the steady income that had been guaranteed by his previous job, Derrick was under immense financial pressure. This was intensified by the discovery that his partner was expecting. Initially, Derrick asked Linda to abort the pregnancy, but she refused, and they welcomed Jamie in 1994. This broke the couple's relationship. It was unable to cope under the stress. To the outside world, Derrick presented it as an amicable split. However, police discovered that in the final stages of the relationship, the couple had heated arguments, which resulted in the police being called on one occasion, but no charges were brought against either party. No one could deny that despite the separation, Derrick still played an active part in his children's lives. He loved his sons dearly, and I believe that his request for an abortion was not because Jamie was unwanted, but because Derrick was afraid he would not be able to support his family. Friends and family remarked at how elated he was to become a grandfather for the first time. In May 2010, just 2 weeks prior to the horrendous incident, he became a grandfather. He was so proud of his new grandson. Derrick seemed to have this deep-rooted fear of financial failure. Perhaps he felt overshadowed by his own brother's financial success. In 1997, the twins' father, Joseph, loaned David £25,000. When their dad passed away the following year, there was a caveat in his will that if the loan had not been repaid, the amount would be deducted from David's inheritance. Their father's estate was initially estimated at £200,000. However, once debts and taxes were taken out, the amount of the payment was reduced to just £10,000, which was paid to his wife Mary. This left Derrick and the twins' elder brother Brian with nothing. Derrick perceived this as his father favouring his twin brother, and small seeds of resentment began to grow. He did not voice his feelings, as from a very young age all displays of emotion were discouraged by his father, so he internalised it. To the community, Derrick was a quiet, unassuming man. He enjoyed a drink down the pub at the weekends, and only when he'd had a couple of drinks did he lower his guard, primarily expressing his concerns for his mother's health. He rarely revealed little else regarding his emotional state. During the week, Derrick would be seen down at the taxi rank on Duke Street in Whitehaven, where they waited to collect their fares. He kept mostly to himself, not participating in a lot of the banter between the drivers. Over time, Derrick began to feel like he was being targeted. He started to believe other drivers were stealing his fares. In his mind, they were taking money from his pocket. He also learned that they were commenting on his personal hygiene and the cleanliness of his taxi behind his back. He had issues with one driver in particular, Darren Newcastle. He was known to play pranks on other drivers. Some of them were harmless, but some were more serious, involving damage to their vehicles. On one occasion, he slit the tyres on Derrick's taxi, causing him to have to replace all 4. Darren openly boasted to other drivers that he was responsible. To him, it was a bit of harmless fun. However, for Derrick, he began to feel like he was being victimised. As a taxi driver, Derrick encountered issues with customers. In February 1999, 3 youths left the cab without paying. The incident resulted in the conviction of one of the youths. On the 4th of October 2002, Derrick Bird was working in Rockington, a town 8 miles north of Whitehaven. Here he was assaulted outside the Fusion nightclub. During the attack, he was pushed to the floor and kicked in the face. He suffered a broken nose and a swollen lip. Despite his attacker being arrested, all charges were dropped when Derrick refused to attend court. He did, however, attend his doctors a number of occasions after the incident. He was complaining of flashbacks and had lost his sense of smell. This doctor testified later at the inquest that he had no concerns regarding Derrick's mental health. He admitted that losing the ability to smell was disorientating for the patient. He seemed to have adjusted. And Derrick did not mention experiencing flashbacks in subsequent appointments. One underlying issue Derrick seemed to struggle with was the fear over finances. He struggled to cope when he lost his job at Sellafield and was overwhelmed by the pressure to support his growing family. By 2010, these fears began to grow and manifest into paranoia. As he was self-employed, he had to submit an annual self-assessment tax return. Shortly after he declared his 2009 income, he started to receive letters from Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, requesting information relating to his low declaration of income. This sent Derrick into a spin, and he went to his brother for advice. David put him in contact with a close friend and solicitor, Kevin Commons, who was able to advise Derrick that he had no reason to fear being prosecuted, as he had not committed any offence. Kevin referred Derrick on to an accountant called Peter Elwood to help him, as he believed he would benefit from more specialist advice. Derrick seemed to be getting increasingly paranoid about the fact he could go to jail. Despite reassurances from his brother and his solicitor, Kevin Commons, he was becoming more certain that David and Kevin were conspiring against him. And when a meeting was set for the 2nd of June to discuss his financial concerns, Derrick had an irrational belief that they had arranged for him to be arrested. People around him started to note that his behaviour was changing. He was becoming more withdrawn, making obscure comments, but nothing that gave people major cause for concern. In the weeks before the 2nd of June, he spent more time alone in his car, spending hours driving the isolated back roads of the county. On the 1st of June, Derrick visited his friend, Neil Jacks, in a highly agitated state. He was convinced he was going to be arrested the following day, and was terrified of going to prison. But nothing in his behaviour could prepare Neil for what Derrick would do less than 24 hours later. Shortly after midnight on the 2nd of June 2010, David Bird was asleep in bed at his home when an intruder entered his property and shot him 11 times. Then, at 5:15, witnesses observed a silver Picasso sat on the road near to the home of Kevin Commons. The solicitor left his house at 10 a.m, but found his way blocked by the Picasso. A man got out of the vehicle and fired a gun at Kevin. The first 2 shots shattered the windscreen and damaged the roof, and Kevin was shot in the shoulder. He exited his vehicle and ran back towards his property in a desperate attempt to get away from the gunman, who opened fire 2 more times. The gunman then returned to the Picasso and drove off. Kevin's neighbour, Susan Mooney, had witnessed the incident, and shaken up she went to her neighbours for help. At 13 minutes past 10, she called the police. She was clearly upset by the incident, and the 999 operator had trouble deciphering what she was trying to say. She desperately explained to the call handler that she had heard shots fired. At first she thought it was an air rifle and they were shooting at the sheep. The operator asked her again what had happened, and she stated, I quote, "A fella getting out of a car and they parked like nose to nose. I've watched it and thought, oh, they're not shooting sheep. And I've seen a fella running up the road out of the white van, and then this other fella kept shooting, and I've watched it till he got to the top and out of sight, but I haven't seen this fella come back into his van. But the other fella took off in his car. I'm just frightened he's wounded up the top." Susan continued by giving a description of the car the gunman had fled in, as a silvery blue Picasso with the word taxi written in yellow on the side. Unfortunately, when the description was passed on to dispatchers, the car was described as being a yellow taxi. Another issue that confused matters was that the area Susan was ringing from is near a rubbish tip, from where police had received numerous reports of air rifles being used to shoot rats, which led to the incident being deemed as low priority. At 10:25 a.m, the Picasso approached the taxi rank at Duke Street in Whitehaven. A minute later, at 10:26 a.m, Susan Rooney received a call back from the police control centre. They wanted to gain more information. She was able to advise them that an ambulance was required. However, when questioned if the weapon was an air rifle or a shotgun, she was unable to answer. After a couple of minutes, she seemed certain it was in fact an air rifle. Meanwhile, in Whitehaven, the Picasso pulled up at the taxi rank. The driver lowered the passenger window and summoned Darren Rucastle to the vehicle. Recognising the driver as Derrick Bird, Darren bent down to speak to him. He was then shot in the face and neck, and as he fell, Derrick shot him in the abdomen. Darren died from multiple gunshot wounds, killed by a man who believed he had been victimised by Darren. Derrick then took aim at taxi driver Donald Reed, who in an attempt to shelter from the gunman was shot in the back. Despite his injury, Donald crawled along the pavement towards the motionless body of Darren Rucastle, at which point Derrick exited the Picasso and aimed his rifle at Donald. But before he could take a shot, he was startled by someone shouting at him, and quickly he made his way back to the taxi and drove away. The gunman wasn't gone long. He circled back towards the taxi rank, driving slowly past. He then circled around again. This time, as he drew near to Donald's position, Derrick aimed the rifle out of the passenger window and fired 2 shots. Fortunately, he missed the injured man, as the bullets damaged nearby properties. At 10:30, an unarmed officer arrived at Kevin Commons' house and discovered the solicitor deceased on the driveway, at which point armed response units were sent to the address. They believed the shooting was an isolated incident, as police were currently unaware what had taken place in Whitehaven just moments earlier. At 10:31 a.m, as armed response teams made their way to Kevin Commons' crime scene, Derrick Bird had his next victim in his sights. Just 500 yards away from the taxi rank, another taxi driver, Paul Wilson, who was walking along the pavement on Scotch Street. Derrick called Paul over to the car, and unaware of the danger, the man went to greet Derrick, only to be shot on the right side of his face. Derrick then left the scene. Paul was taken to the nearest police station, where he was able to tell them the identity of the gunman. By this time, police had been alerted to the incident that was unfolding, and all officers were advised to be on the lookout for the Picasso and its driver, but they were warned not to apprehend him as he was armed and dangerous. One police officer was flagged down by a man called Paul Godwin, who had witnessed the shooting at the taxi rank and had seen the direction Derrick had headed. Quickly, the police officer got into Paul's vehicle and they traced the gunman's route. As they caught up to the Picasso, a police van joined them in following Derrick. They did not, however, attempt to stop him, as none of the officers had firearms. While being followed, Derrick aimed his gun out of the driver's window and fired at taxi driver Terry Kennedy as he drove past. Terry was seriously injured, as was his customer, Emmy Percival. Derrick then manoeuvred his vehicle, so the driver's window was facing the pursuing officers. He aimed his gun at their vehicle, forcing the car's occupants to take cover. This bought Bird enough time to drive away from them. Although they attempted to follow him, they soon lost him in the maze of country roads. In just half an hour, Derrick injured 4 members of the public and had killed Kevin Commons and Darren Rowcastle. The officers who'd followed Derrick were criticised in the press for not attempting to apprehend the gunman. However, a review into the incident deemed they had taken the best course of action, as they were unarmed officers and, having seen Bird coldly shoot 2 members of the public, there was a high possibility that he would have inflicted injury or death on the officers also. Armed response vehicles had now been deployed and ordered to go to Bird's last known location, the Woodhouse Estate, roughly 1 mile away from Coach Road, where Terry Kennedy and Emma Percival had been shot. Officers were instructed to seek out the gunman, and if they encountered him, they were authorised to confront him. Air support was brought in. This was provided by the police helicopter, which was sent from the neighbouring county of Lancashire. Despite low visibility, the crew persevered in their attempt to help apprehend the gunman. Police also put the Civil Nuclear Constabulary on alert. Their role is to protect nuclear facilities in the UK, including Derrick Bird's previous employer, Sellafield Power Plant, which, due to its proximity to the incident, was considered a potential target. At 10:37am, the ambulance service were asked to attend the incident at the Duke Street taxi rank. The ambulance service response to the crisis was placed under review, as despite having sufficient units to attend, they were not deployed due to fears for paramedics' safety. This meant that police officers were left at scenes to attend to those who required medical attention. They were using their own vehicles to transport casualties to the nearest hospitals, which resulted in fewer resources being available to assist in finding the gunman. The review concluded that every incident the paramedics were asked to attend was also attended by the police, who would have provided sufficient protection for them to treat the casualties. One incident was highlighted in the report regarding the conduct of the ambulance service. The report stated that although a vehicle was deployed to attend the shooting of Terry Kennedy and Emma Percival, when it arrived at the scene, it was advised to not treat the casualties and withdraw by their control room. It was only due to the insistence of a police officer at the scene that the paramedics remained. The report concluded that although they can never be guaranteed safety in incidents where the perpetrator is on the loose, the ambulance service must respond more dynamically to future events, particularly if the suspect has left the scene and the police are on site. The review board said, I quote, "It would be reasonable for the public to expect the ambulance service to attend the scene where there is residual risk." By the time the ambulance service were asked to attend the taxi rank, police had already established that Derrick was targeting specific individuals. However, his subsequent victims seemed random, and the control room started to get calls that lacked clarity. Many of the following incidents were reported as accidents, or officers would just happen upon a victim. It was evident at this point that Derrick Bird's extensive knowledge of the area gave him a significant advantage and allowed him to evade capture. The next reported sighting of Derrick was by a lady walking her dog along a narrow country road called Alderrig. The road is lined by farmland and is barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. As Jacqueline walked her dog along the grass verge, a car approached her and pulled up. The driver began to call to her, asking if she had the time. She got nearer to the Picasso. Her dog began to tug on its lead, trying to pull her in the opposite direction. That's when she noticed the man had a gun and she hurriedly followed her dog's instincts. Jacqueline observed as the car drove towards the village of Egremont, unaware of how lucky she had been. Sadly, the next lady Derrick encountered was not so fortunate. Just 5 minutes down the road, Susan Hughes was walking along Grove Road, heading towards the centre of Egremont. When the Picasso pulled up beside her, she was shot through the left breast and abdomen. And while she lay on the pavement, Derrick exited his vehicle and walked up to her. Witnesses described how she fought him before he shot her a final time in the head. He claimed his next victim just a minute later at 10:54am. Kenny Fishburne was walking on the opposite side of the road as Derrick approached. When the gunman saw him, he pulled over to Kenneth's side of the road and fired a fatal shot, which penetrated Kenneth's neck. Derrick's attacks were escalating as he shot Leslie Hunter at 10:55. The gunman had once again lured him to the car, waiting for Leslie to bend down at the passenger window before shooting him. The bullet struck him in the face and another in the back as he tried to flee. Just 42 minutes after the police had been alerted to the incident, a negotiator was already attempting to contact Derrick, using any numbers that were thought to be connected to him. All attempts failed. It would later transpire that Derrick had left his mobile phone switched off in a coat pocket at his home. Meanwhile, as police continued to hunt for him, Derrick found his next target. At 10:57 a.m, he stopped a 15-year-old girl called Ashley Glaister, again under the pretense of asking for the time. On this occasion, Ashley saw the gun as she went to peer through the window and was able to duck out of the way as the firearm was discharged. Derrick fired at her again as she attempted to run. The bullet narrowly missed Ashley, and Derrick drove off, heading in the direction of the village of Wilton. At 11 a.m, police received calls that a body identified as David Bird had been found murdered at his home. However, the police maintained focus on apprehending the gunman, unaware that David was his first victim. While his brother's body was being reported, Derrick stopped at the house of a couple who were unloading shopping from their car. He asked for the time, but neither Gladys nor Joseph Warbrick approached the vehicle. Instead, Joseph shouted the time to the Picasso driver. Unable to get a clear shot, Derrick drove on, leaving 2 more people to feel blessed that day. By this time, the police knew they needed to warn the public of the danger, particularly as he appeared to be heading towards areas with high populations. The inquiry into the incident highlighted, quote, Cumbrian Constabulary quickly identified that it had a duty to warn the public. They used their media lines, their website, shopwatch radio links, direct phone calls to vulnerable locations, and the use of the sky shout from the helicopter to warn the public. As the public was advised to take shelter, Derrick Bird was continuing to use his local knowledge, utilising single-track roads and dirt tracks to avoid police. On one of these lonely back roads, he killed Isaac Dixon. He had suffered 2 gunshot wounds fired at close range. His body was found later that day. Between 10:30 and 11, Derrick had targeted random victims. At approximately 11:10, he arrived in the village of Wilton, with a specific target in mind, Jason Carey, who had been a member of the Solway Sub-Aqua Club Committee, of which, as a keen scuba diver, Derrick was also a member. It later transpired that there had been a disagreement between Derrick and the committee regarding his use of the club's boat and what was deemed to be dangerous diving practice. Several witnesses testified that Derrick had held a grudge against the committee, and one member in particular, Jason Carey. Derrick pulled up outside the house Jason shared with his wife Deborah, and began to sound his horn repeatedly. Jason had been working the night shift and was in bed, so his wife Deborah proceeded to answer the door. However, their dog was barking incessantly, and so she put the canine in a room at the back of the house to allow Jason to sleep. By the time she'd moved the dog, Derrick had grown impatient and drove away. Once again, another pet helped prevent its owner from becoming a victim. Tragically, this only made Derrick choose a new target, Jennifer Jackson. He had passed her on his way to Jason Carey's home, and as he drove away, he pulled up beside her. Jennifer was on her way to meet her husband, James, when Derrick shot her once in the chest and twice in the head. Her son Christopher, who was working nearby, heard the shots being fired. Derrick continued through the village of Wilton. He drove past Townhead Farm, where 2 neighbours were chatting. The Picasso did a U-turn and headed back towards them. Derrick fired at them both. The first shot struck the male in the head, killing him instantly. He would be identified as James Jackson, the husband of the lady Derrick had shot a few minutes earlier. The neighbour James had been talking to, Christine Hunter Hall, was hit in the back as she tried to take cover. The shotgun pellets caused severe injuries, including a punctured lung. The gunman then left the village, driving past Jessica's lifeless body. He was seen by a cyclist on the road that leads towards Sellafield Power Plant. and another witness observed the Picasso driving through a set of red lights. At 19 minutes past 11, all officers were advised that the gunman could be emotionally or mentally distressed, which may result in irrational behaviour, and anyone who encounters him should be mindful of this fact. Gary Purdom was working in a field, unaware of the gunman heading his way. His body was found lying in the grass, having suffered multiple gunshot wounds. After finishing a phone call with his manager, estate agent James Clark was returning from a cancelled viewing. It was 11:25 a.m. His car was found on its side on the grass verge. The driver's window and roof showed signs of damage, and the wheels on the vehicle were still turning. The body of James Clark was recovered from the wreckage, with a gunshot wound to his head. Initially, the incident was reported as an accident by witnesses who called the police. Harry Berger was the next person to encounter Derrick Bird, who was heading towards the town of Seascale. Harry was driving on a narrow road, which passes beneath a railway bridge, when the Picasso drove straight at him, forcing Harry to reverse his Land Rover back out of the tunnel. Harry mouthed an insult at the Picasso driver, who then shot him twice, causing severe injuries. A convoy of 3 armed response vehicles came across Harry's Land Rover. Unable to pass, members of the public pushed the car out of the way. This incident was recorded on someone's mobile phone. Those gathered were relieved to see the emergency services, but perplexed when they did not stay at the scene. The review highlighted the armed officer's decision not to stay, stating that in context it was the right decision. These officers have a job to protect the public. Their duty was to apprehend a dangerous man. They were right to continue, knowing that Harry Berger was being cared for by members of the public. At 11:30 a.m, Michael Pike was cycling along Drigg Road. Derrick Bird shot at him 2 times. The first shot missed, however the second shot was fatal, and Michael died at the side of the road. 2 minutes later, Jane Robinson was delivering catalogues door to door. She was shot in the head. Police speculated that from the nature of the wound, Jane had also been lured to the passenger window of the Picasso before being shot. Witnesses observed that Derrick was now driving in an erratic manner, as the Picasso fled the scene of Jane Robinson's murder. An armed response unit passed him travelling in the other direction. Due to the narrow roads, by the time the armed unit had turned around, they had lost sight of the suspect. However, it was a sign they were closing in on him. At 11:34 a.m, a woman was found collapsed at the side of the road. She had been shot in the head. Jackie Lewis fortunately survived, but has no recollection of the incident. For the next 15 minutes, Derrick continued on towards the village of Boot. His driving became more frantic. Fortunately, due to the police issuing warnings to the public to stay indoors or find shelter, he did not encounter any more potential targets. This changed at 10 to 12, when he spotted holidaymaker Fiona Mority. She approached the vehicle, believing the driver had stopped to ask for directions. Just like the others who bent down to talk to him, she was shot in the face, causing serious injuries. With blood obscuring her vision and severe pain, Fiona managed to get away from Derrick. She collapsed not far from the rear of his vehicle. He then put the car in reverse and proceeded to aim at her, but then changed his mind and left her lying injured in the road. By 12 o'clock, over 40 armed officers from Cumbria, Lancashire and Yorkshire had been deployed, assisted by officers from the Cumbria Nuclear Constabulary. Off-duty police officers also arrived to work in order to help their colleagues. Derrick arrived at a business called Sims Travel. He opened fire on the premises. Fortunately, no one was injured in this attack, and Derrick continued. He next shot at a family, out walking with their young children. Thankfully, again, the bullets missed. The gunman seemed to be losing focus, and his aim was getting worse. Just like his driving, his behaviour was becoming increasingly irrational. Perhaps he was aware that the police were catching up to him, or maybe his mental state had deteriorated further. In quick succession, Derrick found his next 4 targets. Nathan Jones and Philip Moore were leaving the campsite when the gunman discharged his weapon. Philip was uninjured, but Nathan suffered severe facial injuries, just like Samantha Christie. Samantha had been travelling with her partner Craig when they stopped to take a photograph. Derrick pulled up next to them and asked Samantha if she was having a nice day. As she approached to answer him, she was shot in the face. Derrick then ordered her partner, Craig, to get in the car and drive away. With a gun aimed at him, Craig left Samantha and drove off. As he did so, the gunman fired at the vehicle. Fortunately, he missed his target. As Craig drove away, he stopped to warn two cyclists that they were in danger. Moments later, Derrick encountered the same two cyclists, Philip and Anne Law. He fired at them, but once again his aim was off, and luckily the couple escaped unharmed. Recklessly driving along a narrow road, Derrick's vehicle collided with a number of parked cars. As he weaved his way along, like a ping-pong ball, he bounced between parked cars and a dry stone wall, which resulted in one of his tyres being punctured. Unable to continue driving, Derrick abandoned the car, but not before a group of holidaymakers offered to help him. He politely declined their offer and proceeded to walk away. With hunched shoulders, he walked over a bridge towards Oak Howe Woods. When police arrived at the scene of the abandoned car, they began to conduct a search on foot. They followed Derrick's route into the woodland, an action that was commended by the review board. Quote, "The bravery of the officers who entered the woods in search of Derrick Bird cannot be overstated. The woodland is dense and is situated on a hill. It is commonly used by local scout groups to build hides. From his elevated, well-camouflaged position, it is very likely that Derrick Bird could have seen the officers approaching before they saw him." During the search of the woodland, the officers discovered the body of Derrick Bird. He had turned the gun on himself. Cumbria police had first been alerted to the threat at 10:13 a.m. 2 hours and 52 miles later, it was over. Despite attempts to understand what caused Derrick Bird to commit such a horrendous act, no singular explanation could be found. It was speculated there was a number of contributing factors. He had become increasingly paranoid that people were out to get him, from the other taxi drivers to his own brother. He was concerned about his finances and his mother's declining health. It was believed how he was raised not to show emotion or to discuss his feelings. He became mentally overwhelmed and unable to cope, which caused him to take the destructive actions on June 2nd, 2010. The subsequent inquest concluded that there was no way to identify that he was a potential risk prior to the incident. Derrick Bird's funeral was attended by over 100 people. Amongst the mourners was Paul Wilson, who had been shot by Derrick. He stated he had come to pay respects to his friend, not to the stranger that attacked him. Derrick's actions divided the community. Some could not pay respect to a man who had committed such an awful act. Speaking before the service, the priest, Mr. Marshall, said, "I've described endlessly to people about the good man, the nice man, the loving, caring man that he was. And on that day, that dreadful day, there was another man doing the things that he did." Keith Wilkinson, who was a friend who had known Derrick since primary school, addressed the congregation, quote, "Who would know that one day someone so very close to us would break down, his mind lost to darkness and despair, and would be the cause of such loss and tragedy? If this affliction could snap a steady man like him, it begs the question, could it happen to any one of us?" After the funeral, a statement was released by a family friend on behalf of Bird's sons. It read, "Derrick was many things to many people, but to us he was just Dad. To us, he was a loving and caring family man, well known and well respected in our local community. We will never understand what was going through his mind on Wednesday the 2nd June, or why he killed and injured so many people. All we can say is that we are utterly devastated by his actions and deeply saddened by the legacy of pain he has left behind. Our love, thoughts and sympathies are with the families who are suffering at this time. We will miss our Dad greatly and hope that we, along with all the families who have been impacted by this crime, can somehow try to move on and try to rebuild our lives." Due to the close nature of the West Cumbrian communities, the incident had a deep impact. It affected the whole area, as many people had a connection with the victims either socially, through work or through family. The report commended the actions of the police officers who knew many of those affected personally, either as friends, neighbours or family members. yet they remained focused and professional throughout the incident. One example of how close the communities are connected was a 999 operator who was on duty that day at the West Cumbria Communications Centre. She was recognised by the review team as being particularly competent in the way she conducted her duties that day. The review board stated, quote, "This was despite the fact that her husband was an unarmed officer searching for Derrick Bird during the incident. Her parents were in Whitehaven Town Centre with her young baby at the relevant time, and her brother was one of the potential targets whose home Derrick Bird attended and whose neighbour Derrick shot dead. During his spree, Derrick Bird injured Donald Reed, Paul Wilson, Terry Kennedy, Emma Percival, Leslie Hunter, Christine Hunter Hall, Harry Berger, Jacqueline Lewis, Fiona Moretti, Nathan Jones and Samantha Christie. He claimed the lives of 12 innocent victims. They were David Bird, Derrick's twin brother, described by his daughters as, quote, "You were quirky, hilarious, cheeky and downright cute. You brought laughter everywhere you went and always put a smile on everyone's faces. You always showed us girls great affection. Like at Easter when you used to eat the back half of our Easter eggs and then wrap it back up, so we'd never know." Girls paid tribute to their father's keen sense of mischief, saying, "And only you could get away with asking every girl you knew if they'd still been taking their ugly pills." 60-year-old Kevin Commons was described by his friend Helen McNeil as, quote, "A truly unique man, as so many of our friends have reminded me in recent months through accounts of his inspiration to others, his generosity of spirit and his willingness to help and support the less fortunate, not only in his role as a solicitor, but as a friend and neighbour." Darren Rucastle, the 43-year-old taxi driver, was the son of Ted and Elizabeth and had a son and daughter. His parents said Darren was so tragically taken from us. He was a beloved brother, brother-in-law, dad and uncle, the life and soul of the party. He would be sadly missed by all who knew him. Rest in peace, Darren. He was a keen Speedway supporter and a football fanatic who supported Middlesbrough and would have been looking forward to the World Cup. He liked to laugh and was known for his sense of humour. 57-year-old Susan Hughes' family said she was a proud and determined mother who was completely irreplaceable to her family and friends. Her friends described her as a private and quiet woman who spent a lot of time caring for her severely disabled daughter. Kenneth Fishburne, who was 71, was described by his family as a quiet, private man who liked nothing better than a few bets and a game of snooker. Kenneth had spent most of his life serving in the armed forces, including being a UN peacekeeper. 65-year-old Isaac Dixon worked as a part-time mole catcher and was affectionately known as Spike. He had 2 sons, Martin and Wayne, and 6 grandchildren. His family said he could eat like a horse and always enjoyed his food. He always managed to retain his tall, lean figure though, which is how he gained his nickname Spike. Mr. Dixon's neighbour, Joan Ferguson, also paid tribute to him. She said he helped everybody. He was that sort of person. He was a gentleman. He did a lot for everybody if anybody wanted him. He will be sadly missed. 68-year-old Jennifer Jackson and her husband James Jackson were a popular couple who had 2 children, Christopher and Catherine. They were integral members of the village of Wilton, helping out at community events and supporting residents. Reverend Barbara Jeeps said at their funeral, "I keep hearing stories of how supportive they were. One lady suffering a bereavement would go to their house for tea and cake, and James would talk and joke with her, really helping her through the bereavement. They were a beautiful couple, very much loved." The family of 31-year-old Gary Purdon released a statement through Cumbria Police. They said Cumbria had lost one of its favourite sons, and his death had left a hole in the lives of his wife Ros, his sons Cameron 8 and Flynn 2, his father Jack, mother Bridget, brother Rob and sister Becky. He was loved dearly by all his family and everyone who knew him, a gentle giant who would do anything for anyone. His 2 boys, Cameron and Flynn, were his pride and joy. The other 2 loves of his life were rugby league and farming, and he worked on his father's farm from the day he left school, never wanting to do anything else. 23-year-old James Clark was due to marry his fiancée, Leanne Jarman. She said, "He was not just my fiancé, but my closest friend. He is my life, my world, my everything. Taken too soon. He gave so many people love and joy. He touched so many lives, but he did not realise how cherished he was. We are all truly devastated." His parents, Richard and Jane, stated that he was the most wonderful, gentle, loving, considerate man, much loved by his family, his brother and his fiancée, and all his friends. Michael Pike was 64 years old. His family, wife Sheena, son Jason and daughter Jude, called him a kind, brave and generous person who achieved much more than he expected in his life. His son continued by describing the grandfather of 3 as a much-loved husband, father and grandfather, who had been a happy man at the time he died and satisfied with the things he'd achieved. Jane Robinson was 66 years old. Her twin sister Barry spoke fondly of her, saying, quote, "Jane was such a caring, considerate and generous person in the local community, and always had time to help people. She was the best sister I could ever have, and as twins we were especially close. Her kindness to people also extended to animals and birds. For many years she worked tirelessly for the PDSA and later devoted her time to caring for birds and was especially fond of her pigeons. She was a real seascale person and loved the area so much." With the recent pandemic, I just wanted to take a moment to say I hope you, your families and friends stay safe and healthy. I will be back with episode 13 next week. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.